Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today on behalf of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I'm the CEO of the Institute, Bryce Wakefield. Many of you will know that we've got something of a long and storied history. We're founded in 1924. Our first branches were founded in 1924, and thus we've served Australians for over a century, promoting an informed public debate on this nation's foreign relations. As a membership-based organisation with branches in every state and territory, we work tirelessly, excuse me, to provide forums like this one, where policymakers, scholars, business leaders, and members of the public can come together to explore Australia's place in the world. Tonight's event continues our tradition of bringing insightful voices to the fore at critical moments. It's also part of a significant year for us, with the second branch of the Institute, our branch in Victoria, turning 100 this year. That is after New South Wales last year. This marks another milestone in our long history of engagement with Australia's international affairs community, and we welcome members online from New South Wales and Victoria tonight, as well as other members and people from across the country and beyond. Our speaker tonight, who has contributed greatly to Australia's discussion on maritime security, in fact, I suspect many of you will know her from television or other forums, is Jennifer Parker. Jen is currently an expert associate at the National Security College at the Australian National University and an adjunct fellow in naval studies at UNSW Canberra. She brings to these academic and policy roles more than 20 years of distinguished service with the Royal Australian Navy, where she specialised as a principal warfare officer, including advanced training in anti-submarine warfare with the Royal Navy. Her operational experience spans from the Middle East to the Caribbean, covering a diverse range of maritime environments and mission profiles. In addition to holding senior appointments nationally and internationally in areas such as force design, strategy, career management, international exercise, and operations, she served as an exchange officer with the Royal Navy and as second in command of HMAS Darwin, one of Australia's guided missile frigates. In an era marked by growing strategic uncertainty and intensifying great power competition, Australia's maritime strategy is more vital than ever. Jen's presentation this evening will address precisely this need. She will explain why a robust maritime strategy is central to Australia's defence posture and outline the key elements that demand urgent attention if we are to protect our sovereignty and defend our interests beyond our shores. Her remarks will offer a concise, forward-looking perspective on how we might navigate the complex and evolving challenges of maritime security in the 21st century, a topic that is not only timely but essential. Before we begin, however, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, who are the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I extend that respect to any and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today, either in person or online. And now please join me in welcoming Jennifer Parker to the podium.
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's always very embarrassing when someone reads out your bio. Don't know if my career was that distinguished. Hopefully it was. But look, thanks so much for joining us on a cold winter's night in Canberra, and especially those that have travelled so far. I know that this delegation came just from the Philippines just for tonight. So thank you very much to the Undersecretary and his team. Thank you very much to the ambassadorial staff that are here and everybody else. Look, I'm going to try and talk for about 35 minutes and then allow about 25 minutes for questions. Where am I coming from and why are we talking about this tonight? Look, I think that, of course, defence and national security have become a key issue in Australia for a lot of reasons. One, we're going through an election campaign, but two, more broadly and sadly, the world and the region are deteriorating. And the chances of having to use defence capability in the event of a crisis or conflict are increasing. Now, that doesn't mean that I think a conflict is inevitable at all in this region, but things are not trending in the right direction. And so we really need to think about what does a robust strategy look like for Australia's defence. And when I say Australia's defence, I don't mean the defence of Australia, which I think are two different things. One of the reasons that kind of prompted me to talk about this evening, one, my wife would say, because you're always talking about this, but two, I have become concerned about some of the debate put forward. And in fact, a former Prime Minister said to me about 5 weeks ago, he called me and he said, Jen, he was talking about Sam Roggeveen's the Echidna strategy, which I would commend to you. I think anybody who talks about our defence, I think it's an important contribution. I disagree with many of its assertions, but I think it is an important contribution and worthwhile read. But this former Prime Minister said to me, it is the book on how to defend Australia. And I took issue with that because I think that it underestimates, with many defence strategies that talk about territorial or continental defence of Australia, the importance of Australia's sea lines of communication and the requirement to protect those in the event of a crisis or conflict, and just how vulnerable we would be. So tonight I'm going to talk about Australian maritime strategy. It is, as a nod to Sam's book called The Echidna Needs to Be Able to Swim. And it's really talking about the fact, and by the way, thank you very much to Camille Goodman, who is here, who found this ABC article that conveniently came out yesterday talking about the fact that actually, potentially, echidnas actually originated from the sea. And I would say that historically, Australia's strategy has been a maritime strategy. It's just been one that we have outsourced to allies instead of conducting ourselves. So what am I going to go through? Look, I'll talk briefly about what is a maritime strategy. I'll talk about the significance of the maritime domain to Australia, and people often groan when you talk about that. You're like, oh, I've heard it, I get it, we're an island, yep, move on. But I think it is underestimated when we think about the vulnerabilities of Australia, particularly in a prolonged conflict. I'll talk about some of the ideas that have been put up in terms of defensive strategies. I'll talk about some of the common tropes. What are the things that I get asked all the time? I.e., can't we just replace warships with drones and move on? Orcas is about striking mainland China with tomahawks, which makes no sense to anybody whatsoever, but I'll talk about why. A deterrence by denial strategy means sea denial. No, it doesn't. They're two different things. I'll talk about that. So we'll go through some of those things. I'll talk about the difference between maritime trade and seaborne supply, because they're incredibly important differences. And when we talk about protecting Australia's maritime trade, we're not talking about protecting the 26,000 ships that visit Australia every year. We're talking about protecting that critical supply that Australia would need to function, including its fuel, which is imported. We import about 91% of our fuel. We don't even hold the IEA standards for how much fuel we should have in Australia. So if you're thinking of an idea of territorial defence of Australia, you don't account for the fact that you need to protect our fuel supplies, then your F-35s won't be flying for very long. So I'll go through a list of those things. As I said, I promised to keep it to about 35 minutes, so I might cut some of it out and try and get into some of the questions. We'll see how we go. Right, so the first thing is, what is a maritime strategy? And I know Dr. Jack McCaffrey is online, and we've been debating this. It's one of the key points of my overdue chapter in my PhD. In many ways, there are two kind of ways to view a maritime strategy. The first way is that a maritime strategy is really about the coordination of all aspects of national power in the maritime domain. And a lot of that comes down to structure, it comes down to coordination, oversight, governance, legal frameworks, etc., etc. The second way to think about a maritime strategy is also as less of a domain strategy and a way of thinking about defending a country that is wholly dependent on the maritime domain. And the reason I highlight the two differences, both are equally important, But often when I talk about maritime strategy, people say, yeah, but we also need a cyber strategy and we also need an air strategy. And yes, that's true. But maritime strategy, in terms of the big S for Australia, is a way of thinking about how you defend Australia, acknowledging that the vulnerabilities that we have exist in the maritime domain. So, two slightly differences there. Okay, so in terms of the significance of the maritime domain, look, I just want to highlight this quote. I promise this will not be one of those talks about maritime strategy where I talk about old dead guys and referencing the whole time, which is most talks about maritime strategy, no offense. But I do think it's important to highlight this quote from Alfred Thayer Mahan. So he was a US admiral. He wrote a book in 1890, which is really considered one of the seminal books on maritime strategy. It's incredibly hard to read, and I can't say I recommend it, but I do recommend this, no offense, because people like the cult of Mahan too. But what I do recommend is this quote, right? He talks about the fact that wars are won by the economic strangulation of the enemy from the sea. Now, this is not necessarily universally true, but it certainly is true for island nations, right? And this is something that when we think about the idea of a defensive strategy for Australia and the idea of making Australia a hard target territorially, it ignores the fact that why would you try and attack Australia? Why would you attempt to invade Australia when you can cause Australia to capitulate by interrupting its seaborne supply, its fuel, its fertilizer, its ammunition? And when you think about Australia's dependence on seaborne supply or maritime trade more broadly, we are actually the fifth largest user of shipping services in the world, which is concerning when you think about the fact that we have about 15-ish ships that are 2,000 tonnes or greater that are actually flagged to Australia that we could actually requisition in the event of a crisis or conflict. 98% of Australia's merchandise, so its imports and its exports, go through Australian ports. And I mentioned before that we actually import 91% of our fuel, right? That is a huge vulnerability. EEZ, our exclusive economic zone, is larger than our mainland, and 99% of our internet, so our connectivity to the rest of the world through the internet, travels through undersea data cables. I won't go through the rest, but it kind of highlights that for Australia, an island nation that is thoroughly dependent on imports, on exports for our prosperity, and on undersea cables for our external communication, the whole idea of wars are won by the economic strangulation of the enemy from the sea starts to really make sense. So this is why I struggle with the ideas of defensive strategies. And again, I would commend the Echidna strategy to you, written by Sam Roggeveen. And Albert Palazzo has a book coming out called The Big Fix, which there was I guess, an introduction to in The Guardian and The Conversation this week. I think it's important to debate these ideas of defense strategies. And that's why I commend them to you. But I disagree with their premise. I disagree with the idea that you can defend Australia by simply making Australia a hard target. A couple of reasons I disagree with that. One, certainly when we talk about the Echidna strategy, some of the thinking behind that is also by making us a small target to reduce the chances of China's aggression towards Australia. The first point I'd make about strategy is that strategy should not be threat-based, right? You don't start with, this is the threat, and therefore this is how we defeat that threat. Because inevitably, the crisis or conflict that occurs is not the one you're predicting. And there are many examples throughout history we could go through all night about how that is the case. So when you talk about the design of a strategy for the defense of your national interests, it really needs to think about what are your vital interests and how do you defend them. And I've got that point on the screen. I was trying to find a great quote. There is a guy called Admiral Robert Hill that wrote a book called Medium Power Maritime Strategy. It is a great book. He talked about the fact, this is a paraphrase of his quote because I couldn't find his exact quote today. But anyway, the idea that vital interests endure, but threats evolve. And so strategy needs to be built accordingly. Your strategy needs to be built on what your vital interests are and how you defend them. So when you think about Australia's vital interests, and I'll delve into this a little bit further, based on this, it's pretty hard to argue that a lot of Australia's vital interests don't exist in the maritime domain and that you can ignore the idea of protection of sea lines of communications as a major function of our defence force and a major design criteria of our Navy, our Air Force, and to a lesser extent, but still an important extent, our Army. So some of the common tropes, and again, in some of these ideas put forward of defensive strategies, whether it is Albert Palazzo's piece this week, last week in the Guardian or the Conversation, or it is the Echidna strategy, or it is some of the other conversations you hear about the concept of territorial defence and ignoring the maritime domain, there's a lot of things that come up in Australia. And I'm sure they're going to be your questions, which I've just got them up front. You'll see a photo on the slide. That is the Ruby Mar. The Ruby Mar is a merchant vessel that was sunk by a Houthi missile around February 2023. I've got that there because it highlights that, yes, missiles in the littoral domain, that is the area where the land is influenced by the sea and the sea is influenced by the land, can be detrimental to ships. That's true. But do you know how many military ships the Houthis managed to hit with their hundreds of missiles and drones and USVs, uncrewed surface vessels, they have fired between November 23 and January 2025? Absolutely none. None. So when we have this idea that surface ships are obsolete because of the development of missiles, which you do find mentioned in the Echidna strategy, you find it mentioned in many other defensive pieces, it's actually not true. Now, of course, the range of the littoral, the range that the land can influence the sea and the sea can influence the land, is increasing because of the range of missiles. But a well-defended ship is very hard to hit. And so I think that that is a key assumption that needs to be really highlighted, that surface ships, from what we've seen in naval warfare in the last 2 years, are actually pretty capable things and certainly not obsolete. Now, other people will point to the Black Sea and say, but what about the Ukrainian use of drones? They have managed to sink Russian ships. And it's true to say that it is incredibly impressive that a country that did not start the war with a navy has managed to sink or damage or put out of action a third of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Now, that's been a combination of missiles, uncrewed aerial vehicles, and uncrewed surface vessels. Most of those vessels have actually been damaged in port, where we know that vessels are vulnerable. If you want to target a submarine effectively, you put a missile into it in port, right? The ones that have been sunk at sea, there have been a couple of vessels sunk at sea, absolutely. Most of those vessels, you can actually see the video footage of that online, and you can see that most of those vessels aren't defending themselves. Upper deck lighting on, easy target, weapons not manned, etc., etc. There is one case where there was a corvette where the vessel was defending itself, absolutely, but it really didn't have the effective defences. And so I'm not to say that uncrewed surface vessels won't be an important component of sea denial campaigns. They will, but the Black Sea example is far from proving that surface ships are obsolete. The whole idea that drones will replace ships and submarines also, which was in Albert Palazzo's piece in The Guardian, that is just not what the evidence of the last 2 years of naval warfare shows us whatsoever. It shows us that drones are certainly a good investment for denial strategies, absolutely. But when you look at the full spectrum of the responsibilities of ships, they can't do those. I don't know an uncrewed surface vessel that can conduct a boarding operation, for example. And again, in terms of the ability to take out ships, there's actually not that many examples of them being effective of sinking ships, right? The whole idea that, in fact, I won't have time to go through all of these, so happy to answer plenty in the question. The one I will highlight, though, is this idea of distance as a strength. So a lot of the defensive strategies put out talk about the fact that because of our distance, that means we can isolate ourselves and defend ourselves territorially. 2 points with that. One, yes, distance is a strength, but it is also a vulnerability. And the vulnerability for Australia is our distance means we are dependent on long sea lines of communication that have to go through critical choke points. So your distance only becomes a strength if you can mitigate that vulnerability. The second element of distance being a strength is to make the most of that distance. You need to have the ability to protect power and deal with threats to Australia further from the coast. It makes no sense to sit here and wait for somebody to come and strike you when you could intercept them at a greater distance. And then finally, I mentioned in the intro, but I just want to highlight again this idea that our strategy of deterrence by denial, which is our strategy in our national defence strategy, means sea denial is fundamentally wrong. Now, what do I mean by sea denial? Sea denial is the ability to deny an enemy's freedom of maneuver effectively in a certain area. Now, sea denial is something that Ukraine has effectively achieved in the Black Sea. It's generally something that occurs close to your coast. The reason I highlight this is the idea of deterrence by denial, so denying somebody's ability or deterring them from wishing to interfere with your national interests, is very different to denial in terms of an area focus. Right, there's probably enough on that. The rest I didn't go through. If you're interested, ask me a question and I will go through it, especially if it's about Orcas. Right, so I talked about the idea that if you don't protect your sea lines of communication for an island, you're incredibly vulnerable. But I also said that does not mean that you send an escort frigate for every single 26,000 ship that visits Australia. Of course, when we talk about maritime trade, in the event of a crisis or conflict, there would be a rationalisation of what is important to Australia. What are the critical things? It's the same way, in many ways, there was that rationalisation during COVID. When we think about the idea of maritime trade, it is typically important. It's the important export and import of physical goods in the medium, large size merchant ships, right? Now, during a conflict, you do want to be able to protect free-flowing maritime trade to a point. That's not every of the 26,000 ships that visit Australia annually. But if you can't protect some elements of maritime trade, you are going to struggle to keep your economy going, right? You need to be able to make money. You need to be able to support the war effort. And if we think about what a conflict in the Indo-Pacific would look like if one was to occur, it is not a short-term thing. This is a prolonged conflict. The second element I mentioned, though, which is the more important element, which is that critical seaborne supply, which is really a subset of those things that you cannot function without. And for Australia, those things start to become pretty obvious in terms of your fuel, your ammunition, your fertilizer, etc., etc. When you're thinking about the protection of maritime trade and critical sea lines of communication, the critical seaborne supply is your primary focus, with the other elements of maritime trade to keep your economy going as your second focus. And the reason I highlight this is because every time somebody who puts up a defensive strategy talks about the defense of maritime trade, they say, well, it's just too big, so you can't do it anyway, right? Which is just not the case. And if that was our approach to defense, we would have to capitulate very quickly in the event of a crisis or conflict. This is a good table that I stole from Australian Naval Institute paper in 2022, which talks about the effect on a nation if maritime trade can't be maintained and if seaborne supply can't be maintained. And just note that point down the bottom, if your seaborne supply is degraded, if Australia's fuel supplies, fertiliser, ammunition, you list the rest of it, is intercepted or interrupted, that means Australia being forced to surrender without a single boot being placed on the Australian mainland. So I've talked about the fact that when you think about strategy, you don't define strategy based on the threat. You define strategy based on the protection of your vital interests. Now, how you protect those vital interests will be obviously impacted by the capabilities of a potential adversary or a threat. But to start from first principles, you need to understand what is important to you. I mentioned before Admiral Robert Hill's Medium Power Maritime Strategy, which is, I think, a great book for anyone thinking about defence strategies for Australia. He talks about two core vital interests of any country, which are really things that are derived from the UN Charter, which is territorial integrity, right? So territorial defence is important. Political independence. But then those other things that really matter to your country, maybe because of a way that you view yourself in the world, maybe because of the geography of your country. And so for Australia, some of those things include, and this is not an extensive list, we could debate this all night, what are Australia's vital interests? The point here is to highlight that there are vital interests that you need to defend. Clearly, Australia views itself as a middle power. Clearly, it doesn't believe in a foreign policy of capitulation. And so certainly for a middle power, a degree of autonomy for Australia is important, right? That degree of autonomy means that we need to be able to have influence both diplomatically and militarily in the region, which implies the ability to power project. Unimpeded seaborne supply is clearly a vital interest of Australia's, and I've talked through that probably to death. Maritime trade to support the economy through a prolonged crisis or conflict. A secure nearer region encompassing both maritime Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, a stable Indo-Pacific, the list could go on. These are the things that matter to us. You cannot protect those vital interests by parking a bunch of missiles and drones around the coast of Australia. It doesn't make sense. Now, the bottom ones, I didn't come up with myself. I've got the 2016 white paper there. That is the last official document where we outlined what our core defence interests are. Now, that's not necessarily exactly the same as vital interests, but they're pretty similar to the things that I mentioned there. And it does talk about the importance of protecting the economy and maritime trade. And in fact, if you go back through almost all of Australia's strategic documents, the whole idea of protecting those things has been critical to Australia. The thing is, in our earlier years, we outsourced the protection of those through our alliances to the UK and then the US. So we never said they weren't important. We just didn't think we had the ability to defend them ourselves. So what is our current maritime strategy? Well, it would be wonderful to pick up a document and say, this is our maritime strategy. Some countries do publish maritime strategies. Australia has published a civil maritime strategy. I think it was published in 2022. I might have gotten that year slightly wrong. But we don't have an overarching document that talks about maritime strategy more broadly. And I think this is a challenge for Australia. Now, some people say, yeah, but you can pick it up in speeches and policies and you kind of put it together. But if you pick it up through speeches and policies, it's not clear that somebody's actually sat down and thought about how all of these things are interconnected, right? And I'll give you an example. So our civilian maritime strategy, because we bifurcate the idea of civil and military maritime strategy, although increasingly in this region we're blurred, is a maritime militia a civil or a military threat? There's a question. Is interception of a subsea cable or degrading of a subsea cable by a tanker a civil or a military threat, right? I don't think you can bifurcate the two. But even with our current setup, in our civil maritime strategy, the word subsea cable or undersea cable isn't mentioned once. That's civil maritime infrastructure, right? And I'm not doing that to pick at the person who I'm sure worked late nights and weekends and drove that strategy, right? It's not having a crack, but it's saying that if you don't have a comprehensive maritime strategy that looks at all of these elements and how they interact, things fall through the cracks. Another issue with the bifurcation of our maritime strategy. So our civil maritime strategy, which is executed by Maritime Border Command, and so a lot of people in Australia, when I say we need a Coast Guard, will say, but we have a Coast Guard. The equivalent is Maritime Border Command. Maritime Border Command, in terms of the ABF maritime element, and it's made up of more than just the ABF maritime element, because Maritime Border Command is a joint interagency task force. But in terms of the Border Force maritime element, that's about 550 people and 11 vessels. Our exclusive economic zone is bigger than our land mass, and we're a continent, right? So you can see that that doesn't match. So what happens then is our civil maritime threats are actually mitigated through our Navy. So Australia's Navy, which is, arguably in terms of ship size, the smallest it's ever been, and arguably, depends on how you cut it, right? But certainly the smallest it's ever been since World War II, also does a lot of the civil law enforcement functions. So we're kind of saying, hey, we've got, I'm going to give a really crap analogy and I'm probably going to get it wrong, right? But it's like saying, I've got $50 to spend, I've got $50 for this and I've got $50 for that. Well, you only have one $50, right? You only have one Navy. If your Navy is fulfilling the function of a Coast Guard, if you're sending destroyers and frigates to chase illegal fishers, which Australia has done, or potentially LHDs, then you're not fulfilling the functions of a Navy. right? So again, I talk about in terms of a current maritime strategy, you need to have a comprehensive maritime strategy that deals with all aspects of national power in the maritime domain. Setting them up between civil and military means that things fall through the gaps. Another element of Australia's maritime strategy that has developed in the last couple of years has been this idea of a maritime strategic fleet, which is important. In the event of a crisis or conflict, Australia does need the ability to move that critical seaborne supply. Now, in terms of most of the international vessels that move critical seaborne supply, you would not have that in the event of a crisis or conflict, right? When an area flares up, civilian ownership of ships, they are not going to put those ships to that area. We've seen that in the Red Sea. We've seen that through, various crises in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Predominantly, that's because of the cost and the war risk. So you need to have some sort of incentives. Now, some incentives that Australia has tried before during conflicts includes things like subsidisation of war risk insurance, etc. But also it includes the requisition of Australian flagged ships, which was critical to Australia during both of the world wars. The problem for Australia at the moment is, as I mentioned before, there are 15 ships flagged to Australia that are above 2,000 tonnes. If you actually looked at the usefulness of many of those ships, that number would come down. And if you took all of those ships, you'd have no ferry to get across Bass Strait, right? This is a problem. So the current government went to the 22 election talking about a strategic fleet, which has now become an element of our maritime strategy. However, I'd have to say most of the recommendations from the task force that looked at this have not been enacted to date. So there was a tender last year for, I think, $21 million over 5 years. If you're watching and you wrote that and I got it wrong, I apologise, but it's in the orders of magnitude. So I highlight there the point about our current maritime strategy is we need to have a holistic maritime strategy that understands the impact across military and civil because they're not bifurcated and thinks about national power more broadly, which includes things like Australian flagged vessels. Australia's national defence strategy is our look at the military elements of maritime strategy, certainly in the public domain. There may well be a separate document in the classified domain that I'm not aware of. I suspect there is probably not, but there could be. What does it talk about? Well, one of the first things it talks about, the truth is in the name, National Defence Strategy. It talks about a coordinated whole of government and whole of nation approach that harnesses all arms of national power. Now, when you think about our maritime strategy, it's very hard to argue that it is coordinated or whole of government. In fact, our search and rescue agency is different to our border force maritime elements, which is different to our fisheries management agency, which is different to our navy. And there are over 20 departments or so that have key stakeholder or are key stakeholders in Australia's maritime strategy. So I think that needs a review. I think that needs significant consolidation. I did release a paper late last year on a Coast Guard for Australia that talks about the consolidation of those departments. But certainly in our National Defence Strategy, we do acknowledge the importance of whole of government when we think about strategy. We also do acknowledge the requirement to protect Australia's economic connection to our region and the world, and it is one of the 5 tasks given to the ADF in the National Defence Strategy. The challenge, though, is that task is not resourced. Having been the Director of Plans in the International Maritime Security Construct, protecting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz in the 2020 Gulf crisis, and the Director of the Combined Maritime Forces in Bahrain, looking at counter-piracy operations, amongst other things, the idea of protection of shipping is ship-intensive. You need quite a few warships, and Australia currently has 10, and that's if they're all at sea. So as much as I think our National Defence Strategy does acknowledge the military aspects of a maritime strategy, it has some of the important points, I'm not sure that we're actually resourcing that nationally, which becomes a challenge. So how do I think we should think about maritime strategy? Look, I want to acknowledge that when we think about maritime security, it is a broad topic. So I haven't talked about the impacts of pollution, of climate change, of fisheries, all of the things that would need to be wrapped up in an effective national maritime strategy. What I am more focused on is the idea of defending Australia's vital interests in the chance of a crisis or conflict, and how you think about maritime strategy through that lens. I think we need to take a layered approach. Now, that is an image created by ChatGPT. It's terrible. It's not to scale. I'm not saying that we should overlap all of Southeast Asia, and I'm not saying that all of those islands have been abolished, right? Which is why you shouldn't use ChatGPT for things. But I was too lazy to draw some concentric circles on a PowerPoint, so there we go. But what I'm thinking about how we should think about our maritime strategy, which acknowledged should be a whole of nation, coordinating all aspects of national power, is through a layered approach that firstly has the idea of strategic resilience. So one of the things the Echidna strategy talks about, which is entirely correct, and in fact Hugh White has spoken about this, many others, is that Australia does need to increase its strategic resilience, right? So its ammunition stocks, its fuel stocks, its ability to create some things in Australia ourselves that we need. And in some ways, we're doing that through the guided weapon enterprise in defence, although certainly not quickly enough. So that is the first start. But that itself doesn't necessarily negate, or does not at all negate, your ability to have to protect the maritime domain. The second layer is I think we need to think seriously about how we conduct port protection. How do we do that? Now you're like, oh my God, that's so obvious. Of course we're going to be doing that. I don't think we are. I don't know who in Australia is responsible for port protection from a military threat. Certainly from a civil threat, it's the police. But from a military threat, no. And when you think about most of those ships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet that were damaged that I mentioned before, most of those were damaged in port. The third layer, we need to think about coastal trading protection, which was a key function of the Royal Australian Navy during World War II. We forget that a lot of our goods in Australia actually move around by coastal trade. And in many ways, some of the elements of that include thinking about the maritime strategic fleet, being able to move fuel supplies or ammunition supplies around Australia if necessary, and also that idea of a coast guard, which would be focused a lot on search and rescue and illegal fishing, but in the event of a crisis or conflict would also have to have a military role in terms of that maritime territorial defence and a limited capability to protect coastal shipping, in my view. The fourth layer is thinking about the idea of the protection of maritime trade and seaborne supply through having the capability to exercise limited sea control, convoys, escorts, and some of that is also through alliance relationships and understanding what the delineation is. Again, I mentioned Richard Hill's medium power maritime strategy. In that, he talks about how medium powers should think about alliance relationships. He talks about the fact that you should not design your force simply to be integrated or slot in to an alliance, because then you lose control of what your force is doing. You should have agreed delineation of operations and missions. And in fact, in the maritime domain in 1951, that is exactly what Australia did with the US when there was the Radford-Collins Agreement, agreed between Admiral Radford and Admiral Collins, who was the Chief of Naval Staff in Australia, which talked about how Australia and the US and New Zealand would separate responsibility for protection of shipping in the region. Now, I'm not saying that that is the blueprint for today, but I'm saying that is how we should think about it. We should design our force to be able to do certain missions and operations independent, but in support of our alliances. In many ways, that is the concept of self-reliance within the alliance in the maritime domain. The fifth layer being that idea of power projection, strike, amphibiosity. And the importance really there comes into the Army's pivot towards the maritime domain, which I haven't done justice in this talk because I don't have enough time, but it is a really important element of Australia's military maritime strategy and something pleasing to see. And then the sixth layer being alliances. So understanding that we don't have all the resources in the world, certainly in terms of protection of sea lines of communication, yes, most of our maritime trade goes through the South China Sea right now. In the event of crisis or conflict, you would see that those trade routes would change. You would probably be changing your trading partners. Most certainly, Australia would be changing their trading partners. And you would have to protect lengthy sea lines of communication. Australia will never have a military that is capable of protecting all of that, which means understanding what the role of your alliances will be in that case, which is something that we had to do during World War II in terms of our escort of convoy operations across the Indian Ocean. It's not new to us. Now, that's 35 minutes. I promised time for questions, so I won't go through the rest, except to say, so where do I think we go from here? Look, I think we really need to firstly understand what is the critical seaborne supply and the maritime trade requirements in the event of a crisis or conflict. I'm not convinced we do. Now, again, we may, but I remember when I was sitting in Bahrain as a director of plans in the international maritime security construct, highlighting back to Australia that yes, most of our fuel comes from Southeast Asia in a refined state, but in an unrefined state, it comes across the Indian Ocean, and we care deeply about the Middle East and the Indian Ocean from a maritime perspective. I think the second thing is we need to think about this development of a layered maritime strategy, making sure we have the structure, the coordination, and the resiliency, right? That whole of nation approach to it. Thirdly, I think we need to consider the amalgamation of relevant agencies and the generation of a maritime department with an associated minister. And I'll look back to, and Desmond Woods is in the room, so he's going to tell me if I get my naval history wrong, which I often do. But during World War One, the demands on the Navy were so much that the Department of the Navy was actually separated from the Department of the Defence. Now, we went back, and I'm not suggesting that is a way forward. I don't think that is a way forward. But what I'm saying is we do need some sort of structure that coordinates our maritime thinking and our maritime strategy beyond just the maritime contribution to military defence, right? Which is thinking about subsea cables, which is thinking about maritime strategic fleets. It sits across too many departments and agencies. And then finally, to prove that we actually understand how all those things are interconnected, I do think Australia should publish a maritime strategy. India has done it. The US has done it. The UK has done it. They're all different types of maritime strategies, and you can critique all of them. I'm not saying there's an exemplar out there, but I think it would be a useful exercise for Australia. Now, that gives 19 minutes for questions, so I will wrap it up. And I've barely talked about Orcas, which I'm sure there'll be a question for. So happy to take questions, critiques, debates, disagreements.
Okay, great. That's fantastic, Jen. I'm glad that you're so fastidious about time as we are. So we'll get you home on time, people. Look, before I start, let me just make sure that you know, even though you may not be able to sense the amplification, that that there are people online. So if you do have a question, please do hold the mic up to your mouth and talk. And stand up, state your name and any affiliation you might have. But for now, we'll go to our online questions, and they're flowing in. There's one here from Christopher Skinner, who's a member of our 101-year-old branch in New South Wales. And he asks, would you agree that Australia needs to address potential threats in all directions rather than purely the northern bases as supported by the 2024 National Defence Strategy?
Great to see you online, Christopher. Thank you very much. I do agree. I'm going to do a little bit of a plug. I actually talked about this in the Insiders podcast last week with David Spears a little bit. I completely agree with that. I talk about this in more detail in a report I wrote in 2023 for ASPE talking about a maritime strategy. Absolutely. Look, I think that, of course, the northern approaches are very important to Australia, right? But we also need to understand that other areas, including the Southern Ocean, will potentially become critical to Australia for many reasons. One, I mentioned in the event of a crisis or conflict, trade won't continue along there's no roads on the sea, but along the sea lines of communication that are normally taken, right? Ships pick their path based on the way they can get there quickly and save the most fuel, right? That will not be the case in the event of a crisis or conflict. And we have actually seen that with the diversion around the Cape of Good Hope from most of the vessels that would have gone through the Red Sea. Now, in the event of a crisis or conflict in the South China Sea, I think Australia will see a significant trade route that goes to the south of Australia, which Australia will need to think about and need to protect. We're also increasingly seeing in expeditionary China. We did see the circumnavigation of Australia by 3 Chinese warships, and so we do need to think about the Southern Ocean. We also need to think deeply about the Indian Ocean. One, as I mentioned before, and there's a good piece that was in ASPE's The Strategist last year from Dr. Richard Dunley, who we do a good podcast together, although he's too lazy to come tonight. I don't even think he's online. But anyway, shout out to Richard. He talked about the fact that maritime trade for Australia in the event of a crisis or conflict will probably be east-west, right? It'll probably be coming across the Indian Ocean. We need to think about how we can protect on that. The second element is this whole idea that an expeditionary China will maintain being constrained within the first or second island chain, I think is a flawed assumption. We are seeing China's progression in the Indian Ocean through their access to port facilities, their base in Djibouti. This is going to be an increasing trend, right? So I think that the whole idea that the threat comes from the north through the Indonesian archipelago will start to change a little bit, right? And so I think we need to think more broadly about that. Also, we know that the contestation that is occurring in the Pacific in terms of access to Pacific islands, right? So we do need to think more broadly in terms of the direction that threats can come from.
Captain, I'm Captain Desura from the Philippine Coast Guard. So, as a background, one of the China's maritime strategy was the merging of the five dragons, wherein most of the agencies bearing fleets have merged into one. Now the China Coast Guard. So, also understanding that Australia's maritime strategy, although I read this narrative wherein ABF has quoted that unlike other ASEAN countries issuing maritime strategy, Australia does not have any. But they view the maritime strategy in two broad lenses, wherein it is a continuous interplay between the conventional military approach and the civil maritime enforcement. So you also mentioned that in order to meet or protect or defend the interests, there should be resilience. So in the operational perspective, interagency or each of these agency will be resilient in two ways. It's either you empower or you equip each of the agencies, because you mentioned that the Coast Guard functions were distributed into several agencies, and you have only a de facto Coast Guard, which is the MBC. So the other means of attaining resiliency is consolidating all this Coast Guard function into one. So my question is, where do we expect Australia be, or where is Australia headed? Are you going to empower these agencies or consolidate this Coast Guard function into one agency?
Look, thank you. I think this is a really important question. I brought this slide up because I published a document late last year with the Australian Naval Institute calling Time for a Coast Guard. Look, where I would like Australia to head is I think Australia does need to amalgamate a number of its functions under a Coast Guard. I think Maritime Border Command was a great idea and it was a leap forward in the early 2000s, but we've moved on since then. And as you mentioned, the whole idea in terms of China's maritime strategy is just a spectrum of operations. There's not the bifurcation of military and civil. And to the point about Australia not having a maritime strategy, we do have a civil maritime strategy, but it is not comprehensive in any way, shape or form. Look, unfortunately, the direction I think we will go is I think we will go with status quo until there is a crisis, unfortunately, which is a shame. In the early 2000s, the Labor Party at the time did have a policy. Kim Beazley was a massive champion, he still is, of a Coast Guard to establish Australian Coast Guard. Now, the Coast Guard they were talking about is not the kind of Coast Guard I'm talking about, but still it was a step in the right direction. It didn't get up. When I pushed this last year to a bunch of ministerial officers, there wasn't a lot of interest, unfortunately. And I don't think they necessarily see that a lot of our success of Maritime Border Command is because of the Navy doing that function. And, the Defence Strategic Review for Australia talks about the fact that we cannot be relying on the military to do civil functions, bushfires, floods. Well, I would put civil constabulary operations or policing operations in the same boat as that. But I'm not seeing a lot of traction. I think perhaps there's room for somebody to do a more in-depth study than mine that actually looks at the costs, because I think if you bear it out, you could actually have a Coast Guard for a lot cheaper than the cost of pulling $1 billion warship to go and chase illegal fishers, which has been done. I've done it myself. But yeah, look, I don't think there is the appetite in Australia right now, short of a crisis, to actually fix that structure, which is a problem.
Thank you. Alex Bristow, Aspie. Jen, I'm sorry for gate crashing late. That's the squeakiest door in the world there, so everyone saw me coming in. My question is going to be about Orcas. It has to be. Not me, but some commentators in this town claim that Australia faces a choice in resources between having a navy or having these new nuclear-powered submarines. Do you think Australia can do both?
So I actually do. I went and reread Matthew Knott's piece in the Sydney Morning Herald. And, if Matthew Knott's online, you might be. He's a great journalist, does some fantastic work. He picked up Marcus Hellier's piece from Strategic Analysis Australia talking about AUKUS being the fourth service in terms of costs. And, Marcus is the leading defence funding analyst in Australia, has been for some time. Certainly deserves a lot of credit. However, when you actually look through the strategic analysis piece on the cost of AUKUS, that statement is kind of over-egged, right? Yes, AUKUS is expensive. $368 billion is the figure that we know. That's a figure that involves a 50% contingency, so $120 billion of that is fudge factor, and that's out to 2055. I think next financial year, and I might get this wrong if Marcus is online, he'll certainly point it out, I think, over the forward estimates or something, we're actually spending about 20 million or something like that, maybe more. It's not huge orders of magnitude. Yes, I take the point that the article that I'm referring to talked about the fact that eventually the RAF capital budget, so that is the budget for new acquisitions within Australia's integrated investment program, will be less than AUKUS, but that's because we have recapitalised the Air Force. You're not constantly recapitalising a service. The Navy is going through that now. Army's going through that to an extent. When you look about the cost of AUKUS over the next 10 years, which is a more reliable figure than between now and 2055, because God knows what will happen between now and 2055 economically, the IIP, Integrated Investment Program for Australia, said the public-facing one, I haven't seen the classified one, $53 to $63 billion over the next 10 years. The government has not increased the defence budget as much as I think they should have, but they have, to their credit, increased the defence budget over the next 10 years to account for the difference between the cost of the attack submarine and AUKUS. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that AUKUS is eating the defence budget. I think the defence budget has issues. It had those issues before AUKUS. It had those issues before the 2020 Defence Strategic Update that announced we had no warning time but put no more money into defence. Those issues come out in gaps in mine warfare, integrated air and missile defence, the list goes on. But that existed before AUKUS. I don't think it's a factor of AUKUS.
Rosemary Ganley, from Defence, a long time ago. You talk about how few naval vessels we have. Are there any plans to actually get more? Are they reasonable? I mean, can we actually see a time when we have enough vessels?
Look, this is a great question, and thank you, Rosemary. Thanks for coming along tonight. Look, yes, there are plans to increase the Royal Australian Navy's fleet. Two key plans. One is AUKUS, which is the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. The second one is the expansion of the surface combatant fleet that was announced in February last year with the general purpose frigate, which has been down-selected to two options, one from Germany, one from Japan. Decision should be made late this year. That will increase the surface combatant fleet to 20. The government, when they announced it, said this was going to be 26 because of 6 autonomous things. Those 6 autonomous things aren't coming. The US isn't even going to build them. So that's a problem. But it is going to double in terms of its current size. However, that's not going to occur really until the late 30s. In fact, between now and the early 30s, the fleet will actually decrease. Well, 2029, it will actually decrease in size. So there are 10 surface combatants currently. Next year, under the government's plans, HMAS Arunta, my old ship, sadly, will decommission, and we'll have 9 surface combatants. So I don't think the plans are adequate. I think they are a step. I think the time frame is wrong. Now, I get that you can't fix 30 years of underinvestment in the Navy overnight, But if our strategic situations are, as we articulate, the most significant since World War II, you can make a decision on a frigate design in less than 2 years, and you can get it quicker and you can build it quicker. And so I'm not sure there's that sense of urgency. I think the second element too, though, is there's too much conversation around frigates frigates, destroyers, and submarines for the Navy, and not enough conversation about the broader capabilities the Navy needs. Mine warfare, hydrography, auxiliary vessels. We have 2 tankers. I think both might be unserviceable. Maybe they're serviceable now. Still 2 tankers. The rule of 3 to 1, right? If you have 3 ships, you have 1 operational all year, 1 training, 1 alongside in maintenance. When you have 2, you don't have a tanker available 365 days a year, and I've just articulated why Australia needs a blue water navy. So I really think we need to think more broadly about naval capability. I think the Defence Strategic Review, unfortunately, only talks about surface ships and submarines. I think that's a mistake. I think the terms of reference for the independent analysis team that looked at the growth of the surface combatants were too narrow. I think the team would say that themselves. And so nobody has holistically looked at what is the structure required for the Navy. And the thing about mine warfare vessels and hydrographic vessels is you could build them in Australia. We did. All right, so you could solve this. I just don't think there's the impetus to do so or the money.
Desmond Woods, ANI. Jen, you've got up on the screen there and you've mentioned mine warfare. We've all got very short memories. We always think that the Battle of the Atlantic was all about U-boats and corvettes. Mines were a huge part of both the battles of the Atlantic, 1718 and 3945. And in our part of the world, mines were critical in the way in which they constrained coastal trade and international trade and cost us many freighters. Cormoran was in the process of being about to drop mines when she and Sydney were engaged. And mines are now much more sophisticated than the tubs of explosive you had to touch in order to set off in World War II. Our mine warfare, mine clearance capability in the next year or 2, having maintained it for decades. It's very hard to convince ministers that something is necessary when you don't use it for 80 years, but it doesn't mean that it isn't. Your thoughts?
No, look, I completely agree with you. I do think that more broadly, and I mean no disrespect to the people that work on this whatsoever, but I think that the structure of the Navy is fundamentally wrong, whether it is the types of vessels it has, whether it is the readiness and preparedness, whether it is the percentage of Royal Australian Navy members that support seagoing units. I think it's structurally incorrect. I think that what that leads to is then gaps in capability like this. Now, there is, of course, budget pressures. The future mine warfare vessel was cancelled in the Integrated Investment Program released by the government last year. Clearly cancelled for a financial pressure, because you certainly don't cancel mine warfare capabilities for a country like Australia. And in fact, we've just invested since the Force Structure Plan in 2020 in acquiring our own mines again, which we built a whole lot of those during World War II in Geelong. So we've invested in acquiring again, but we've forgotten about the fact that we spent years after World War II also cleaning up mines. In fact, we're still cleaning up mines in the Pacific now. And I think, to be honest, any person in defence right now would agree we need this capability. It's probably just a question of funding, but it's just another example of the gaps across Navy. And I do think that at some point there needs to be a step back of what are the functions of Australia's Navy as part of that maritime strategy conversation, and how do we fill those gaps, not just mine clearance, but also hydrography, right? There is one hydrographic vessel left in the Royal Australian Navy, which I understand is not used for hydrographic tasking anymore. So there are huge problems. Now, when the Integrated Investment Program came out last year and the government cancelled the mine warfare program, they did say that they were moving towards autonomous and uncrewed capabilities, which is the direction that certainly some countries are using. And in fact, we've been using that for mine clearance for a long time. But the problem is that they said that they would be launched from a vessel of opportunity. 2 problems with that. For port clearance, maybe, but 2 fundamental problems. One, Australia doesn't have vessels of opportunity, right? To be honest. And the second one is, if you want to do lead-through operations and things like that, actually the signature management of the vessel, so the acoustic signature and the magnetic signature really matters. So you can't just do that on any vessel that you pulled, right? So I agree. It is a huge issue.
Oh, okay. Thank you, thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah, okay. Um, in your presentation, two of your vital interests basically is a secure nearer region and encompassing maritime Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, and a stable Indo-Pacific region and rules-based order. And one of your defense objectives is about coalition. So, how I wonder what is the concept of Australia in terms of coalition, because in our region, it is no brainer that you can't have a stable or secure near region if you cannot control at least sustain the stability in our region with a country that has an hegemonistic mindset and a region that is composed of nations that are either indifferent or not concerned on how to contain that hegemonistic country. So I wonder how Australia would achieve this interest and how about the coalition concept? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think it's a really important question. I think this is one of the areas, and I mean, you might have a more informed point than me on this, but I think this is one of the areas that is actually a relative success story for Australia. I think Australia has done a lot of work. I think Australia really recognises the importance of stability in the region and the importance of relationships. Often Australia is kind of equated to our relationship with the US, and it really undermines the strong relationships that Australia has throughout Southeast Asia, including with the Philippines. And if you look at the Philippines case study, for example, since the, I guess, increase in China's aggression in the West Philippine Sea that occurred beginning of last year, and of course it's been there for a long time, but the increase and the ramping up, Australia was one of the first countries to come and support the multilateral maritime cooperative activities, which enable demonstrations effectively. Australia is increasingly working with the Philippines as a strategic partner. Australia right now has HMAS Sydney deployed, despite the fact that Australia doesn't have many ships, which is a huge issue. HMAS Sydney deployed to the region, conducting a regional presence deployment. HMAS Hobart was there earlier. So I think that despite Australia's limited resources in terms of maritime capability, one of the success stories, from my perspective anyway, has been how it has engaged in the region, increasingly engaged in the region. I mentioned the Philippines relationship, obviously the Indonesia relationship. Our relationship with Indonesia has always been kind of up and down. But I think through our recent defence agreement signed last year, I think it's reaching a high point. Through the complexity of the maritime and joint exercises Australia and Indonesia is doing, it's reaching a high point. For exercise Kakadu, which is a multilateral maritime exercise Australia conducts every 2 years, we had the first Vietnamese ship visit last year. So I think Australia sees that how it achieves kind of that second last point is through increasing relationships in the region, both diplomatically and militarily, and becoming more comfortable with operating with these partners. So I actually think that's something Australia is doing quite well, despite its limited capabilities. Great.
Well, fantastic, and amazing. I don't think, it's very hard to get into detail like that and to be still quite comprehensive and wonderfully entertaining, Jen, and you've done it so well. So thank you. I'd like you to join me in thanking our speaker. As you plugged your special report and Alex's institute, I think we'll plug ours. This is a gift for you. It's Australia and World Affairs. It's a book that we publish every 5 years, going back to 1950. It's a 5-yearly snapshot on Australia and World Affairs, and we hope you don't have it. If you do, then please re-gift it. Yep. If you want a copy, they're on sale in the lobby. Hebe will sell one to you. And thanks for coming. As I said at the beginning of this talk, we are a membership organisation. If you're not a member already, make sure you become a member. I know there are lots of people from overseas here. We do, of course, have online events as well. And we have a number of events coming up here in Canberra, so make sure you don't miss out. Tomorrow, our ACT branch, federal organisation, we have an ACT branch, they'll be hosting an event on the Pacific with James Bately. And then coming up in May, we have an event on whether or not the age of empathy is over, in the context, I guess, of the Trump administration with Claire York. On the 1st of June, we will have Alan Tidwell, who's the head of the Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Studies Centre at Georgetown University, coming in to give a talk on the American approach to the Pacific Islands. After that, we have, John Blaxland is coming in to, John Blaxland, you will know probably, is the representative of ANU in Washington, D.C. He's going to come in and give a talk on From the Bubble to the Swamp. And I'm sure he'll have heaps of insights about the Trump administration's actions and how they affect Australia. And then in July, we'll have Paul Midford, who's an academic on Japanese defense and foreign policy, and he'll be talking about his new book on the Senkaku Islands dispute, which of course is very relevant to a conversation about maritime affairs. So lots of relevant stuff relevant to this talk coming up in the next little while. We are continually updating our schedule. Of course, we have branches around the country that put their events online as well. So make sure that you go to internationalaffairs.org.au and check out our stuff. And become a member if you're not a member already. So thank you very much, and thanks again to Jen.